short part of the story that will make you want more. I stood in the grand hall, heart pounding, as my name wasn't on the list. Everyone else marched in with proud faces. Then the commander looked right at me and said, "Welcome, General Grace." Like this story and drop a comment below. Don't bother subscribing to hear more tales of sweet revenge. Grace Harper was born on a crisp autumn morning and grew up learning to be strong. For 31 years, she carried hope and fierceness in her heart. She believed that one day justice would come knocking at her door. The sun was low in the sky as guests arrived at Elmshadow Manor, a sprawling estate nestled behind tall pines. White columns rose above the entrance, and lanterns flickered along the paths. Today was her brother's ceremony. John Harper was to be honored for his service to the nation, a moment Grace had dreamed of her whole life, until she realized her own name was missing. Grace stepped out of the black luxury car, smoothing the crisp hem of her uniform coat. She glanced at the guest list clutched in her hand. John's name was at the top. Every dignitary's name was there. Secretary Bowman, General Fletcher, Mayor Whitman. But no Grace Harper. Her cheeks burned. She knew the simple reason. John had always overshadowed her. He was the golden boy, popular, charming, and flawless in their parents' eyes. She was the quiet one, smart, fierce, but easy to ignore. A hush fell over the marble foyer as a line of attendees formed. Soft music drifted from behind tall doors. Grace moved to the edge of the line and offered her hand to the aide. He frowned at the paper. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Your name isn't here." She swallowed hard, willing her voice to stay steady. "I'm John's sister. I've traveled for days. Surely there's room for family." The aide shook his head and stepped aside. Grace felt her heart crack. The guests all looked on, curiosity, pity, amusement flickering in their eyes. A low growl rose in her throat. For 31 years, she had watched John slide past every challenge, slick and unscathed. And now, at his greatest moment, they would let her stand outside. A soft voice spoke behind her. Grace turned to see Commander Abigail Sinclair, a tall woman with icy gray eyes and rows of gleaming medals on her uniform. Grace had served under Sinclair years ago in the same academy, earning her stripes through grit and determination. Sinclair paused, then slowly walked toward Grace. "You're not on the list," the commander said, her voice calm but firm. Grace exhaled, ready to plead. Instead, she straightened her spine and stared back. Sinclair's eyes flicked to the list, then back to Grace's face. The clinking of silver and soft murmur of voices echoed through the hall. The air was thick with expectation. Guests craned their necks to see what would happen next. Sinclair cleared her throat. "General Grace," she said, voice carrying across the room. "Welcome." Grace's breath caught. The murmurs rose into whispers. She saw shock on John's face beyond the doors. She saw smiles of confusion on the officers. The aide's jaw dropped. Grace forced a small nod, the weight of every hidden slight and every ignored achievement crashing into her. She stepped forward past the aide and into the hall. The heavy doors swung open. Warm light spilled around her, bathing polished wood and glittering chandeliers. Grace's boots echoed on the marble floor as she marched past rows of officers, standing at attention. John turned, jaw slack, as his sister passed him. His eyes widened in disbelief. He had assumed she would never show. She walked down the center aisle, head held high, until she stood beside Sinclair and in front of a massive portrait of their old commander. The audience parted like water. Then, from behind the podium, the master of ceremonies cleared his throat and announced John's name. The applause thundered. Grace's name still wasn't on any program. She stood silent, heart pounding. Below the cheering crowd, Grace clenched her fists. Every ounce of pain and anger boiled within her. She would show them all what she was made of. A sudden crash of light and sound cut through the ceremony. A figure burst through the high windows, shattering glass and sending crystal chandeliers swinging. Sparks flew. Smoke drifted across the red carpet. The room went dark for a heartbeat. Grace steadied herself, adrenaline flooding her veins. The crowd screamed and ducked for cover. John reached for her hand, but she shook him off and sprinted toward the disturbance. The commander barked orders that were lost in the chaos. As Grace reached the shattered window, she saw flames licking at the drapes and a shadowy figure darting away through the gardens. She recognized the limp banner in his hand, the family crest of the Harpers. Grace's heart pounded so loud she thought it might burst. Her mind raced with questions. Who dared attack her brother's ceremony? Why choose this moment? And most important, what would come next? Chaos reigned in the hall, but to Grace, everything slowed. A cold promise formed in her heart. She would not let this stand. She would hunt down whoever did this. She would make them pay. And so, as smoke curled around the marble pillars and guests fled into the night, Grace Harper took her first step on the path of true revenge. Grace Harper burst through the shattered window frame, jagged glass crunching beneath her boots. Outside, the moon glowed pale over the formal gardens of Elmshadow Manor. Hedges and flower beds lay in perfect rows, but the peace of the night was gone. Smoke curled toward the sky where the red glare of flames danced against the stone walls. The attacker, cloaked in dark clothing, sprinted between the hedges, clutching the Harper family banner. Grace's heart pounded as she launched herself forward. Branches whipped at her face and sleeves, but she didn't slow. She chased the figure past a marble fountain, its water still shimmering in the starlight. "Stop!" she shouted. Her voice echoed through the gardens. The attacker glanced back and stumbled, his cloak snagging on a rose bush. Grace skidded to a halt, seized the cloak, and yanked. The man fell hard onto the gravel path. Grace knelt beside him, gripping his wrist. She peered at his hooded face, but the hood slipped just enough for her to see the outline of a young woman. Tall, slender, with dark hair curling around her shoulders. A single glint of a silver earring caught the moonlight. "Why?" Grace demanded. Flames crackled from the ceremony hall behind her, mingling with the distant shouts of guards. "Why destroy my brother's night?" The woman's dark eyes snapped open. "This isn't about your brother," she hissed, voice low and urgent. She twisted, trying to break free, but Grace held tight. "It is to me," Grace countered, tightening her grip. "Who are you?" The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. "You don't know what you're protecting," she whispered, "and you'll never understand." A roar of disaster cut her off as a section of the ceremony hall collapsed inward, sending a plume of dust skyward. Flames leapt through the broken roof. The night air trembled with the crash. Grace's eyes widened. "No," she gasped. She glanced down at the woman. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Orange light flickered across the gardens from emergency lamps. The attacker, sensing her distraction, lashed out and struck Grace's hand. She yelled, loosening her grip. The woman sprang to her feet and vanished into the maze of hedges. Grace raced after her, but a guard grabbed her arm. "General, get back!" he shouted. Grace shook him off. She cut through the hedges, cutting her hand on thorns, until she reached the edge of the gardens. Beyond were dense woods. The attacker had disappeared. Breathing hard, Grace covered her hand and took in her surroundings. The ruins of Elmshadow Manor smoldered behind her. She swallowed her urgency and turned back toward the house. Somewhere in the darkness, her brother John was in danger. Inside the estate, chaos reigned. Corridors once lined with portraits of Harper ancestors were now slick with water from fire hoses. Guards and staff rushed injured guests to makeshift medical stations. The floor trembled with emergency vehicles idling outside. Grace moved through the crowd, checking on people and issuing calm orders. Stay here. Move away from the fire. Let the medics through. Her voice rang clear above the panic. Even shaken soldiers obeyed. She found John near the collapsed roof section, pulling a guest free from under a fallen beam. He was coughing, tears streaming down his face. "Grace!" he cried when he saw her. He rushed forward and hugged her, but she stiffened. "Are you all right?" she demanded, hands on his shoulders. John nodded, his uniform coated in dust. "I think so." Grace scanned the scene. "We need to evacuate the guests to the north lawn," she said, straightening. "Take 2 squads and guide them. I'll handle the fire chief." He blinked but saluted crisply. "Yes, ma'am." John took off to marshal the officers. Grace strode to the main hall where Commander Sinclair was conferring with the fire chief and security officers. Sinclair looked up as Grace approached, eyes flickering with relief and concern. "General," she nodded curtly. "Commander," Grace replied, voice low. "What's our situation?" The fire chief, a heavy-set man with soot on his collar, gestured toward a burned archway. "Flames are contained now. We've formed a perimeter. No civilians near the east wing until we're sure there's no secondary device." Grace's heart clenched. Secondary device? Sinclair pointed at the charred remains of a carved wooden pedestal that had once held John's ceremonial sword. "The hall was rigged. I found wiring beneath the floorboards." Grace's breath caught. So this was planned. "By someone who wanted to make a statement," Sinclair said gravely. "We need to secure the rest of the grounds and question all staff." Grace nodded. Her blood boiled. Someone had tried to kill her brother. Someone close enough to know when and where. But worse, they'd humiliated her in front of the whole nation. Suddenly, a medic burst through the door, carrying a bloodied man in uniform. "General, this officer found this in the ruins." He held out a small black box. Grace took it. The box was heavy metal, with strange etchings on its surface. "What is it?" she asked. The medic shook his head. "No idea. I think it's another device." Grace's hands trembled. She opened the box carefully. Inside lay a collection of razor-sharp metal cubes, each stamped with the Harper family crest. Next to them was a small folded note. Grace unfolded it with shaking fingers. "To Grace Harper, your moment of shame was only the beginning. A friend." Her blood ran cold. She glanced at Sinclair, who paled. The note burned like acid in her hands. "Someone inside this house wants us destroyed," Sinclair whispered. Grace folded the note. A storm of thoughts raged in her mind. Who could have such hatred? A family rival? A spurned lover? A disgruntled soldier? She looked around at the collapsed beams, the injured guests, the scorched banners. This was more than an attack. It was a declaration of war on her family name. She realized then that revenge would not be quick or easy. The first chapter of her retribution had just begun. Outside, the gardens lay quiet under the moonlight. The shattered banner fluttered between the hedges. Grace picked it up and pressed it to her chest, as though the fabric could hold all her fury and resolve. She walked slowly to the main drive where emergency vehicles still glowed. She saw her brother pacing beside a fire truck, looking haggard but alive. She approached him gently. "John," she said softly. He spun around. "Grace, thank God you're safe." She tossed him the banner. "Keep this. I swear whoever did this will answer to us." John's face hardened. "We'll get them. Together." Grace nodded. In that moment, sister and brother stood united. The world of whispers, wounded pride, and hidden dangers gave way to a clear truth. They would fight as one. As they turned back toward the manor, an explosion sounded to the north. An armored van rocked violently, flames licking from its wheels. Grace's breath caught. The night's horrors were far from over. The night air shook with the blast. Flames roared from the armored van on the north drive, tires spinning against the gravel as the engine seized. A high wall of fire lit up the trees beyond Elmshadow Manor, casting long, dancing shadows. Glass rained from nearby windows. Guests and guards screamed and dove for cover. Grace Harper's heart pounded like a drum. She and John had just turned away from the main house when the explosion hit. The force knocked Grace off her feet and sent her tumbling into the gravel. She tasted dust and heard the van's metal frame wrenching and collapsing. John scrambled to her side. "Grace," he shouted. He helped her up. She brushed grit from her coat, her hand stinging where a shard of glass had cut her wrist. But she ignored the pain. "Are you hurt?" John asked, eyes wide with fear. "I'm fine," Grace said, gripping his arm. "What now?" Sirens wailed closer. The night sky pulsed with red and blue light. Grace looked at the burning van. Its doors were blown off. Inside, boxes stamped with the Harper family seal lay scattered. Some smoked. Others were intact. She realized instantly that van carried items from the family vault. Heirlooms, letters, maybe secrets. A fire crew arrived and doused the flames. Grace and John stepped back as water hissed against the hot metal. A guard called out, "General, Commander Sinclair is waiting inside." Grace nodded and hurried with John toward the house. The broken banner still lay on the ground. John bent to pick it up as they passed. Grace stayed, focused on the manor. She had one thought: the enemy was close. Inside the great hall, the air smelled of smoke and wet carpet. The chandeliers hung crooked, and a section of ceiling had caved in. Older guests sat wrapped in blankets, sipping warm tea. The injured were tended by medics. Sparks drifted from a scorched portrait of an ancestor. Commander Sinclair stood by a large oak table covered in maps and photos. Grace and John approached. Sinclair's face was drawn and tired, yet her eyes held steel. "General," she said, "good to see you safe." Grace nodded. "What have we learned?" Sinclair pointed to a map of the estate. Tiny colored pins marked key spots. "We found wiring beneath the east wing floor. Then the van exploded. Whoever set this up knows our schedule and security routes. They used the vault delivery for the next attack." John frowned. But why the family vault? What could they want from those boxes? Grace traced a pin near the vault entrance. They meant to steal or destroy our heirlooms. Something in those boxes must matter. Sinclair lifted a photograph. It showed the masked woman Grace had chased in the gardens. She pointed to a symbol on the woman's sleeve, a coiling snake biting its tail. "This symbol matches graffiti found near the riverside docks. Someone called themselves Ouroboros." Grace's blood ran cold. She had heard that name in whispers years ago, a secret group of former soldiers who believed the Harper family betrayed them. They blamed the Harpers for debts and broken promises. John's eyes narrowed. "So, a secret army of ex-soldiers is behind this?" Sinclair nodded. "And they think they can scare us into surrendering the family holdings." Grace's jaw tightened. They don't know who they're dealing with. A young lieutenant burst in, out of breath. "General, Commander, you should see this." He handed Grace a small tablet showing security camera footage. The video showed 2 men in state uniforms walking toward the vault door. They placed a small device on the lock. The device pulsed with red light, then exploded softly. The vault door swung open. Moments later, the masked woman dashed in. She grabbed a small wooden box and ran off camera. The men followed, laughing. Grace watched the replay, fists clenching. The vault's main door stood open only seconds before guards found it. Inside, shelves of wooden boxes had been disturbed, yet only one box was missing. "Look," Sinclair said, zooming in. The wooden box had intricate carvings and a small brass latch. That box had been locked inside another steel chest, hidden in a secret compartment beneath the floor. Grace shut off the video. They came for something very specific. John ran a hand through his hair. What could be so important? Grace glanced at Sinclair. We find that box. And we find her. The next morning, rain fell in cold sheets. Grace and John stood by the burned van, examining the boxes that fire crews had recovered. Some boxes were broken open. Others lay untouched. A heavy wooden box, the same size as the one stolen, remained on the gravel. But it was empty. John knelt and opened the lid. It was lined with red velvet where a metal object had rested. Now nothing remained. He closed the lid gently. Grace studied the ground around the van. She knelt and brushed away gravel with her gloved hand. A faint imprint of letters remained on the soil. She rubbed mud away more. The letters spelled out a name. Fisher. She rose. Fisher, she repeated. A name. Our vault keeper was named Walter Fisher, but he died last year. John stared. Do you think someone took his identity? Either that or this was left to point us in the wrong direction. Grace frowned. Either way, it could lead us to the missing box. Sinclair arrived under a dripping canopy, holding a stack of printed papers. We found Fisher's bank records, she said. All his files were wiped just before his death. Someone covered their tracks. Grace grabbed the papers. Look for unusual transactions or transfers. Sinclair flipped through the pages. There's one payment 20 days ago. $5,000. It went to an old estate in Brookfield Heights. Brookfield Heights was a forgotten neighborhood on the edge of town, rumored to be haunted. Many families had moved away long ago. The Harper Estate's old hunting lodge stood there abandoned. Grace's eyes narrowed. That's our lead. An hour later, Grace, John, and Sinclair drove toward Brookfield Heights. Rain plastered their hair and clothes. The roads were slick. As they passed street lamps, the wet pavement gleamed like a mirror. The car slowed at a rusted gate. Behind it, the old Harper hunting lodge rose from the mist. Its shutters hung by broken hinges. Ivy crawled up the stone walls. The windows were dark and covered in grime. Grace stepped out into the rain and looked up at the roof. A small window stood open on the top floor. Faint light flickered inside. There, she said, pointing. John drew his weapon and signaled guards to form a line behind the car. Sinclair checked her radio. All teams in position. Grace nodded. We go in quietly. The box must be here somewhere, and I want my answers. They moved through the gate. The lodge doors creaked as they entered. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and dust. A grand staircase led up to the second floor. Paintings of hunting scenes hung crooked on the walls. John took the lead. He swept a flashlight across the hallway. At the end was a door slightly ajar, light spilling around its edges. Here, Grace whispered. John nodded and pushed the door. It opened onto a large room. In the center sat a rectangular table. On it lay the wooden box and several papers with the snake symbol. The box glowed under a single lamp. Grace rushed forward. She reached out to grab it, but a loud click echoed behind them. The door slammed shut. John dove to block it, but a steel bar slid through the frame, locking them in. Get back, a voice snapped. Figures moved in the shadows. 3 men in dark uniforms, faces masked. One held a rifle pointed at Grace. Grace froze. Her pulse pounded in her ears. The air felt heavy. She lowered her hands slowly. Who are you? She said, voice calm but firm. A man stepped forward. His mask had the snake symbol. He looked at the box on the table. You're too late. He raised the rifle. Stand down or she dies. Grace felt her breath catch. Her mind raced. She had come so far. The missing box was within her reach. Yet now a gun pointed at her. She glanced at John, who stood protectively in front of her. His face was pale but resolute. Grace lifted one hand. Tell me what you want, she said quietly. The man laughed softly. "You don't understand power until it slips through your fingers," he said. He pointed at the box. "That contains the proof of your family's greatest sin. We will reveal it to the world." Grace's heart froze. "What sin?" He smiled behind the mask. "Soon you'll know." He raised his rifle. A shot rang out. Grace's ears rang. She cried out as John fell backward, clutching his shoulder. He hit the floor with a thud. Blood spread across his uniform. Grace ran to him, but the man with the rifle shoved her back with the butt of his gun. "Hurry," he said. "Take what you want." The other two men advanced on the box. Grace struggled to free herself. The room spun, and then the lights went out. Darkness swallowed them. Silence reigned for one breath, before an explosion rocked the lodge, sending wood splinters flying and plunging them all into chaos once more. The blast ripped through the lodge, shattering windows and sending a shockwave that knocked everyone off their feet. Wood splinters flew like arrows, and the single lamp over the table crashed to the floor, plunging the room into flickering shadows. Grace Harper hit the ground hard, dust filling her mouth, and everything felt like it was spinning. Through the roar of splintering wood and cracking stone, Grace heard someone groan beside her. She scrambled to her knees and reached out. It was John, his hand pressed against his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. His eyes were tight slits of pain. "John!" Grace cried, dragging him backwards away from falling debris. She cupped her hand over his wound to stem the flow. He coughed, then nodded slightly. "I'm okay," he whispered, though his face was pale. Behind them, Commander Sinclair lay dazed under part of the collapsed ceiling. Grace pivoted, crawled over to Sinclair, and used her boot to push away a heavy beam pinning the commander's leg. Sinclair grunted, then managed to pull herself free. "Grace." "John." Sinclair's voice was hoarse. She pressed a hand to her temple. "Is everyone—" Grace cut her off. "We'll check on them later." She glanced toward the table where the wooden box had been. It was gone. In its place lay a single glove stamped with the coiling snake symbol. Sinclair picked up the glove, her jaw tightening. They took what they wanted. Grace stood, helping John to his feet. He leaned on her shoulder, wincing with each step. She guided him toward the hallway where two guards were helping a wounded maid limp along. The other masked men had disappeared in the blackout, leaving only echoes of their footsteps. Outside the room, the rain had stopped, replaced by a cold wind that whistled through broken windows. Outside, emergency lights from the manor's security vehicles painted the walls red and blue. The storm of violence had passed for now. By dawn, squads of Harper Guards and local police combed the lodge for clues. Grace, John, and Sinclair huddled in a crumbling corridor, maps and glove in hand. John leaned heavily against the wall, breathing shallow but steady. "That glove," Grace said softly. "They left it on purpose." Sinclair nodded. "A taunt. They want us to know they were here, and that they're still in control." Grace clenched her fists. "We have to move fast. They have the box, and inside it, whatever proof of our family's secret." John's face darkened. "Grace, we've always protected the family's honor. Whatever's inside that box, we have to get it back before they expose us." Grace looked at him, her brave, caring brother, always putting others first. She put a hand on his arm. "We will." She turned to Sinclair. "What's our next move?" Sinclair examined the map. "Last known location was here," she said, pointing to a room at the back of the lodge. "But after the blackout, they could have fled through the underground passages." Grace's heart tightened. The old Harper Lodge was built on secret tunnels used centuries ago for hunting and escape. No one outside the family knew all their twists and turns. "We need a safe place to regroup," Grace said. "We're low on numbers and we don't know where they are." Sinclair tapped her radio. Requesting backup at Elmshadow Manor. Have team ready for rapid deployment. John shook his head. We shouldn't go back yet. They might be waiting. Grace nodded at John. He was right. We need shelter closer. Sinclair, any nearby safe houses? Sinclair thought for a moment. There's our old training cabin in Redwood Hollow. It's hidden in the forest about 20 miles west. No one would find us there. Grace agreed. Then that's where we go. John nodded. I'll organize a convoy. He pulled out his phone and began calling officers. 2 hours later, Grace, John, and Sinclair climbed into an armored SUV with 2 guards. The vehicle rumbled down the wet, twisting road out of Brookfield Heights. Mist curled around tall redwoods, and the morning light slanted through the trees like silent searchlights. Grace stared out the window. The forest looked peaceful, but her mind buzzed. Whoever took the box would have it hidden somewhere, planning their next move. She clenched her jaw. She would not let them win. John sat opposite her, shoulder pressed to his side by a guard's reassuring hand. He caught Grace's eye and forced a small smile. We'll be okay, he said quietly. Grace returned his smile, though her heart ached. We'll find them. Sinclair watched the map on her tablet. We'll get the cabin coordinates in 10 minutes. It's off the grid. She tapped the screen. ETA is 30 minutes. Grace closed her eyes, taking a steadying breath. She thought of the stolen box and the promise of exposure it held. But she also thought of her family, of the people at Elmshadow Manor counting on her to protect them. The SUV rolled into a clearing where the ground sloped down to a tranquil lake. The training cabin stood hidden among tall firs, its wooden walls camouflaged by moss. Smoke rose from the chimney. Someone had lit a fire. Grace's guard scanned the perimeter. Area seems clear. John helped Grace out of the vehicle. Her boots sank into soft earth. She inhaled the fresh pine scent. For a moment, she let herself feel safe. Sinclair led them inside. The cabin was neat. A long table, bookshelves lined with training manuals, and 2 beds tucked into corners. A kettle steamed on a small stove. Grace walked to the table and saw a soldier's jacket draped over a chair. The initials GH were stitched on the chest. She picked it up and remembered the first day she earned her uniform. Proud and determined. She felt that same spark now. John set his hand on her shoulder. Rest here, he said softly. We'll plan our next move. Grace nodded. She hung her coat and looked out the window at the quiet lake. She closed her eyes, imagining the yacht accidents, the loft burns, the vault robbery, all pieces of a puzzle. Behind her, Sinclair unrolled a map on the table. We've pinpointed 3 possible hideouts in the north. They're old Harper properties abandoned decades ago. One is a sawmill in Cedar Ridge, another a boathouse on Lake Crescent, and the last an underground bunker beneath Iron Hill. Grace opened her eyes. They could be in any of those. Sinclair tapped the map. We split into 2 teams. You and John take Cedar Ridge and the boathouse. I'll lead the team to Iron Hill. Grace looked at John. He met her gaze and nodded. Let's do it. By mid-afternoon, Grace and John drove down a gravel road toward Cedar Ridge Sawmill. The sun broke through clouds, casting golden rays on the wooden beams. But the air was heavy. Grace felt it prick at her skin. They parked near the rusted machinery. Guards fanned out, weapons ready. John stayed close. His arm was bandaged, but held steady. Grace led the way through overgrown vines into the sawmill's large bay. Broken planks lay everywhere. Light filtered through holes in the roof. The saw blades hung silent, coated in dust. Stay sharp, she whispered. They crept through the shadowy space, checking corners. Nothing moved, only the echo of dripping water. Then John stopped. Grace. She turned. He pointed at fresh footprints in the soft dirt. A snake symbol was pressed into the soil, same as the glove. Grace's blood ran cold. They were here. Before she could move, a low whistle echoed through the beams. The heavy doors slammed shut behind them. Grace's heart hammered. She reached for her sidearm, but a dart flew out of the darkness and struck her leg. She gasped as her muscles went weak. John shouted and fired a warning shot. The dart's tip glowed faint green. Grace sank to her knee. Her vision blurred. She tried to stand, but stumbled. John caught her arm. "Grace," he cried. Sinclair's voice came through the radio crackle. "General Harper, report!" Grace's vision dimmed around the edges. She clutched John's hand. Her last thought before darkness took her was a promise. She would wake, she would fight, and she would not let them break her. Grace Harper's eyes felt heavy like stones. The sharp pain in her leg faded into a dull ache as darkness closed in around her. She heard John's voice, panicked and full of fear. She tried to speak, but her mouth felt dry and heavy. Then everything went silent. When Grace woke, the first thing she saw was Commander Abigail Sinclair's calm face. They were inside the old cabin at Redwood Hollow. A single oil lamp cast soft light across wooden walls. The wind whispered outside. Grace's leg throbbed, but she pushed aside the pain. "Welcome back, General," Sinclair said softly, brushing Grace's hair from her forehead. Grace sat up slowly. "What happened?" she whispered. Sinclair pointed to the chair beside the bed. John sat there, wrapped in a blanket. His uniform was neat again, and his shoulder wound was freshly bandaged. His eyes lit up when he saw Grace. "You gave us a scare," John said, his voice gentle. "We found you in the Sawmill Bay, unconscious. We carried you here." Grace swung her legs over the bed. Her muscles felt weak, but she tested her leg. The dull ache flared, but she could stand as she took it slow. She nodded. "Thank you, all of you." Sinclair touched Grace's arm. "You were brave, but the dart was a fast-acting neurotoxin. You were out in less than 30 seconds. Grace felt her heart pound. "They tried to poison me." Sinclair's face was grim. "Yes, and they knew exactly how to catch you off guard." John squeezed Grace's hand. "We have no time to rest. They have the box, and who knows what they plan to do with it." Grace inhaled deeply, steadying herself. She slid off the bed and took careful steps toward the table. Sinclair handed her a steaming cup of tea, sweetened with honey. Grace wrapped her fingers around the warm mug. "How many guards do we have?" she asked. Sinclair checked her tablet. 15 at the cabin. Another 10 are scouting the other 2 locations. Grace nodded. "Good. We need more." John stood. "I'll call Elm Shadow Manor for reinforcements. They'll send what they can." Grace sipped the tea. Its warmth spread through her chest, chasing away the cold fog of sleep. She looked at Sinclair. "What have we learned about the box?" Sinclair brought up a photo. It showed the wooden box with its brass latch. She tapped the screen. "This box holds a single old scroll tied with red ribbon. Historical records say the scroll is a letter written by your great-grandfather to the government. It admits the Harpers used their soldiers to break treaties with rival families back in the war. That letter could destroy your family's honor." Grace's heart clenched. "So that's their proof?" Sinclair nodded. "And Ouroboros plans to publish it tomorrow at dawn, live on every news station." Grace's breath caught. "Tomorrow at dawn." John clenched his fists. "We can't let that happen." Grace drained her tea. She set the cup down firmly. "We moved tonight." As dusk fell, the cabin grew quiet. The guards prepared their gear: flashlights, radios, first aid kits. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting flickering shadows on maps pinned to the walls. Rain began to tap on the roof, soft and steady. Grace stood before the table, tracing routes on the map with her finger. Cedar Ridge sawmill and the boathouse had been empty. Now only one spot remained, the bunker beneath Iron Hill. It was a forgotten place, built long ago as a Cold War shelter. No one used it for decades. "Sinclair, you lead the main team," Grace said. "John and I will go first to the bunker entrance. The tunnels are narrow. If we move fast, we can catch them by surprise." Sinclair saluted. "Yes, ma'am." John wrapped Grace's coat around her shoulders. "Are you sure you're up for this?" he asked, worry in his eyes. Grace met his gaze. "They tried to kill me with poison. They burned the lodge and blew up the van. They took our secrets and humiliated us. Now it ends." John nodded. "Then let's finish it." The rain turned heavier as they drove toward Iron Hill. The SUV's tires hissed on the wet gravel road. Grace sat in the back seat, next to John. She held a small flashlight and tightened her grip around its handle. Outside, the world was dark and gray. The hill rose steep and silent, its trees bowed under the rain. The road snaked upward, and soon they saw the old metal doors of the bunker, half buried in earth. Overgrown vines curled around rusted hinges. Sinclair's voice crackled on the radio. "Team A, move in." Grace opened her door. Cold air rushed in, smelling of wet earth. She stepped onto the ground, boots sinking slightly into mud. John followed, close behind. A guard stayed by the SUV, shining a light on the bunker entrance. Grace pressed her hand to the cool metal door. Its surface was pitted with rust. She ran her fingers over old markings. The initials IHB, Iron Hill Bunker. She looked up at John. He nodded. "Let's go," she whispered. They pushed the doors open. The hinges groaned, and the doors swung inward. A gust of stale, musty air greeted them. Grace clicked on her flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a concrete hallway sloping down into the earth. The walls were damp, streaked with moss and water stains. At intervals, rusty lights hung from the ceiling, drained of power. The floor was slick. Grace's heart pounded as she followed John into the tunnel. Behind them, more guards emerged. Sinclair led the second group through a service hatch. Soon, the bunker was alive with quiet movement, figures in dark uniforms moving carefully through the tunnel. They reached a fork in the corridor. The left tunnel was narrow and low, the right one wider with heavy doors every few meters. Sinclair's voice whispered in Grace's ear through her earpiece. They took the box through the left passage. We heard footsteps heading that way. Grace exhaled slowly. "Let's catch them." They moved down the left passage. Water dripped from the ceiling. Each step echoed. Grace's flashlight beam lit old warning signs, faded beyond recognition. She swallowed her fear and pressed on. After a short walk, they heard muffled voices ahead. Grace froze, then crept closer. She saw a door slightly ajar with light seeping through. Two masked men stood inside, sorting papers on a makeshift desk. The wooden box lay open, the red ribbon untied, its scroll visible. Grace's breath caught. She raised her hand to signal Sinclair and John. They moved into position on either side of the door. Suddenly, one of the men turned. Grace's heart froze. His mask fell away as he reached for his rifle. At the same moment, Sinclair kicked the door open and shouted, "Drop your weapons!" The men spun, eyes wide in surprise. They fired. Gunshots rang in the tunnel. Grace dove forward and threw herself at the desk, knocking the scroll and papers to the ground. John rushed in behind her, tackling one man to the floor. Sinclair engaged the other guard, wrestling him for control of his rifle. The tunnel echoed with shouts, crashes, and the sharp bark of gunfire. Grace scrambled for the scroll, her hand wrapped around the old paper, the red ribbon slipping through her fingers. She yanked it free and held it close, the promise of truth burning in her palm. But before she could stand, The tunnel lights flickered and went out. Total darkness swallowed them. Grace's flashlight faltered, then died. The air grew cold and heavy. Shots still echoed, but Grace could no longer see. She clutched the scroll to her chest and called out, "John! Sinclair!" Only silence answered her. Then a low rumble began under her feet. The concrete floor trembled. Dust fell from the ceiling. Grace staggered, fighting to stay upright. The rumble turned into a roar as something massive moved above them. Grace stumbled forward, her heart pounding. The last thing she saw was a shower of sparks from a broken electrical panel, and then the entire tunnel shook as if the earth itself was tearing open. Grace Harper closed her eyes and held the scroll tight, even as the darkness consumed her and the ground beneath her began to crack.